40 million people, one city. And somewhere beneath the neon and the silence, a slow collapse that almost nobody is willing to name out loud. Tokyo was the future. For decades, that was not a slogan, it was a verdict. When the rest of the world's great cities were struggling with crime, decay, and economic stagnation, Tokyo stood apart. Clean streets, punctual trains, technology that felt like science fiction, and a real estate market so valuable that, at its peak in 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace was theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. The world looked at Tokyo and saw what a city could become if it got everything right. But something has changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, not in the way that makes headlines and triggers emergency press conferences. It has changed the way empires always change, quietly, structurally, and in ways that are only visible if you know where to look. If you have been watching Tokyo carefully, really watching it, not through the lens of travel influencers and tourism campaigns, you already noticed something is off. The luxury retail floors that used to require appointments, the office towers with vacancy rates that keep climbing, the neighborhoods that feel slightly emptier than they should, the demographics that no financial model can paper over. What you are about to hear comes from people who built their lives and careers inside this city. A former real estate analyst who spent 15 years advising foreign institutional investors on Tokyo property. A hotel operations manager who watched occupancy patterns shift in ways that defied every forecast. Locals who will tell you, in private, what the official numbers are only beginning to confirm. This is not a travel warning. This is a structural autopsy of a megacity that was supposed to be immune to the forces pulling every other great city apart. If you want to understand how the greatest cities of our time quietly stop being what they were before the rest of the world catches on, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media is not yet ready to cover. Tokyo's crisis carries a number attached to it that is difficult to fully absorb: $50 billion. That is the estimated scale of combined economic strain flowing through the city's ecosystem right now. Accumulated real estate asset deterioration, demographic-driven fiscal pressure, tourism infrastructure overcapacity, built on projections that have since collapsed, and a retail sector that is contracting in ways the official GDP figures have not yet fully reflected. $50 billion is not a rounding error. It is a structural signal, and the people who move money at serious scale are reading that signal very carefully. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand what Tokyo is losing, you first have to understand what Tokyo was. There is a specific kind of awe that Tokyo generates in people who arrive for the first time. It is not the awe of beauty, exactly though the city has beauty. It is the awe of a system so precisely calibrated that it makes every other city feel like a rough draft. The trains run on intervals measured in seconds, not minutes. The streets are navigated by a population of 13 million in the core urban area who have collectively agreed, somehow, to make it all function. The food is extraordinary at every price point. The safety is legendary. And the skyline, that particular Tokyo skyline, layered and dense and endlessly textured, communicates something the architecture of other cities simply cannot. This city has mastered the art of being a city. For foreign investors, particularly in the decade between 2013 and 2023, Tokyo was the safe harbor. While capital fled Shanghai over political risk, while Hong Kong's status as a financial gateway dissolved in real time, while Singapore's property market imposed cooling measures that made returns increasingly difficult, Tokyo remained. The Bank of Japan's ultra-low interest rate policy made borrowing nearly free. The yen's relative weakness made assets attractively priced for dollar and euro-denominated buyers. Prime residential property in Minato and Shibuya attracted sovereign wealth funds, private equity, and ultra-high net worth individuals who were looking for a combination of stability, yield, and prestige that no other Asian city could reliably offer. The global financial press called it the Tokyo Premium, and for a time it was real. But every premium has a shelf life. And the one that Tokyo has been quietly exhausting is not measured in interest rate cycles or currency fluctuations. It is measured in something far more fundamental. Something that no central bank intervention can reverse, and no government stimulus program can restructure. It is measured in people. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, and this is where the $50 billion figure starts to make visceral sense. Japan is aging faster than almost any nation in recorded demographic history. You have probably heard this framed as a statistic: 1 in 3 Japanese citizens is already over 65, a proportion that will continue to rise through the 2030s and into the 2040s with no credible reversal mechanism in sight. But statistics do not capture what this actually means on the ground, inside a megacity, at the level of streets and buildings and economic flows. A former real estate analyst who worked with 2 of the largest foreign institutional investors in the Tokyo market described it this way. Speaking on condition of anonymity, the models kept assuming a stable urban core. We kept modeling Tokyo as if it were London or New York, where you have constant inward migration replenishing the population base. But Tokyo is not London. The domestic migration that sustained it for decades is slowing, and international migration, at the scale needed to replace what is being lost, is not happening. It has not happened. And the political environment suggests it will not happen at the speed the numbers require. The data behind that observation is difficult to argue with. Japan's total population has been declining since 2010. It has lost roughly 3 million people since that peak. Tokyo itself, as a city region, has maintained its population longer than the national trend would suggest, but the mechanism sustaining it has been internal migration from rural Japan, particularly from young adults drawn by employment and opportunity. And that internal migration is now decelerating sharply as the rural source population itself ages and shrinks. The city that was supposed to be permanent is discovering that no city is permanent. The effects on real estate are not theoretical. They are visible in the vacancy data, in the rental trajectory curves, and in a phenomenon that Japanese urbanists have given a name that is quietly becoming one of the most chilling terms in modern urban economics: akiya. Empty homes, ghost properties, structures that have been abandoned not because of poverty or disaster, but simply because there is no one left to occupy them. As of the most recent National Housing Survey, Japan has over 9 million akiya. 9 million. That number keeps growing. And while the concentration of empty properties is still heaviest in rural prefectures and smaller regional cities, the pressure is beginning to reach the edges of the greater Tokyo metropolitan orbit, advancing inward with a patience that no infrastructure project can outrun. But the demographic pressure is only one layer of what is happening. Because Tokyo was not just a place where people lived. It was a machine built around a very specific set of economic assumptions. And those assumptions are fracturing in ways that the city's planners did not fully anticipate, and are not fully acknowledging yet. The luxury retail sector is the most visible fracture line. Ginza, Tokyo's most iconic high-end shopping corridor, became over the course of the 2000s and 2010s one of the most expensive retail real estate markets on earth. Global luxury houses Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Gucci, Dior competed aggressively for flagship positions on Chuodori, the main avenue running through the district's heart. The footfall was extraordinary. The spending power of Japanese luxury consumers, particularly in the domestic market, was something that global brands built entire regional strategies around. Japan accounted, at various points, for somewhere between 8 and 15% of global luxury goods sales depending on the category. For some heritage European houses, the Japanese consumer was not merely important. The Japanese consumer was the market. That relationship is changing in ways that go beyond a typical cyclical correction. Japanese luxury spending has been under structural pressure for over a decade, driven by the same demographic reality that is reshaping the rest of the city's economy. The cohort of Japanese consumers who drove luxury growth, urban professionals in their 30s and 40s with disposable income and strong brand loyalty, is aging into a demographic that shifts spending priorities. The generation coming behind them is smaller, more economically cautious, and demonstrably less attached to the luxury status signaling that drove their parents' consumption patterns. Walk through parts of Ginza at midday on a weekday in 2024, and you will notice something that would have seemed impossible in 2015. Empty appointments, floors within flagship stores where the staff-to-customer ratio approaches 1-to-1, not because the service is exceptional, but because the customers are not there. A hotel manager based in Chiyoda described it carefully. The Chinese tourism rebound after the pandemic brought different visitors than before. The ultra-high spenders have become more selective. The mid-tier volume that sustained the retail ecosystem, that's the gap nobody is publicly talking about. The international tourism dependency that Tokyo built into its economic model after 2013 is itself now a source of vulnerability rather than resilience. Japan's Visit Japan campaign, accelerated aggressively after 2015 and doubled down on in the years before the pandemic, succeeded beyond its stated targets in raw visitor numbers. International arrivals to Japan reached over 31 million in 2019. The numbers were celebrated. Infrastructure was built and priced around them. Hotels opened at a pace that, in retrospect, reflected optimism that the trend line would continue indefinitely upward. It did not. The pandemic collapse was catastrophic and sudden. The recovery has been uneven and structurally complicated by factors that the original forecasts did not model. The yen's extended weakness, while beneficial for making Japan affordable to foreign visitors, has compressed the real returns for businesses priced in yen, serving costs denominated in global commodities and international supply chains. The tourists are returning, but the economics of serving them profitably have become considerably more complicated than the pre-pandemic spreadsheets suggested. A government tourism official, speaking informally at an industry event in late 2023, acknowledged what had become difficult to ignore. We built capacity for a world that arrived and then disappeared and returned different. The visitor is back, but their spending pattern, their dwell time, their accommodation preferences, these have all shifted, and some of the infrastructure we built for the previous version of the visitor is now searching for a reason to exist. This is the pattern, not a single disaster, not a collapse that happens in a quarter and appears in a headline, a slow restructuring of the assumptions that made Tokyo's economic model work happening simultaneously across multiple sectors, compounding against a demographic baseline that removes the absorptive capacity that could otherwise soften the adjustment. And if this sounds familiar, it should. Because this pattern has a historical signature that appears in the record of virtually every great urban center that moved from peak to contraction. The names are different. The geographies are different. But the sequence is recognizable to anyone who has studied how cities age. Edo, the city that became Tokyo, was for centuries the largest city on Earth, by population, a place of such organizational sophistication that Dutch traders in the 17th century described it with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Its very size was both its glory and its vulnerability. When the Meiji Restoration broke open Japan's isolation in the 1860s, Edo transformed with remarkable speed into a modern capital. But the transformation required the systematic dismantling of the structures that had made the old city function. Adaptation or atrophy. The city chose adaptation, and it survived. The question now is whether adaptation is still possible at the speed and scale required. Look further west in history, and the pattern sharpens. Venice, at the height of its maritime empire in the 14th and 15th centuries, was a machine of almost incomprehensible commercial and cultural power. It dominated Eastern Mediterranean trade, controlled access points that no competitor could bypass, and generated a quality of civic life that attracted artists, merchants, and scholars from across the known world. The decline of Venice was not the result of a single defeat or a single decision. It was the result of trade routes shifting slowly, then irreversibly away from the geography that Venice controlled. The city did not collapse. It became something else. A monument to what it had been. extraordinarily beautiful, economically hollowed, a museum of its own former greatness. Tokyo is not Venice. The analogy is not direct, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the underlying mechanism, a city whose economic logic was built around conditions that are now structurally shifting away from it, carries a resemblance that serious urbanists are beginning to name privately, if not yet in print. The financial sector tells a particularly pointed version of this story. Tokyo was, for decades, assumed to be the anchor of East Asian finance. The Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Bank of Japan, the concentration of domestic and international financial institutions in the Marunouchi and Otomachi districts, these were structural features of a city that finance had chosen and continued to choose. But the competition for financial talent and institutional presence in Asia has not remained static. Singapore has executed a sustained, disciplined strategy to position itself as the preferred domicile for wealth management operations, family offices, and international financial institutions seeking a stable, English-language, rule of law base in the region. Hong Kong, despite its political transformation, retains a gravitational pull for certain categories of China-adjacent financial activity. And Tokyo, despite its many genuine advantages, has found itself competing in this landscape with structural disadvantages, language barriers for international talent, regulatory complexity, and a corporate governance culture that has moved toward reform more slowly than the international capital community has demanded. Several major international investment banks have quietly restructured their Asia-Pacific operational footprints over the past 5 years in ways that have reduced the proportion of senior positions based in Tokyo. The announcements, when they come, are framed carefully. Strategic rebalancing, regional optimization. The kind of language that means something has been lost without the uncomfortable work of saying it directly. A former managing director at a European investment bank, now based in London, put it with unusual candor in a private conversation cited by a financial journalist who covers the region. Tokyo stopped feeling like the center of gravity. It happened slowly enough that we kept telling ourselves it was temporary. Then one day you look at where the decisions are actually being made, and Tokyo is no longer in that room the way it used to be. This is not a death sentence for Tokyo as a financial center. But it is a structural demotion that carries real consequences for the talent ecosystem, the service economy, and the self-reinforcing logic that makes great financial cities remain great financial cities. Capital follows talent. Talent follows opportunity, and opportunity concentrates where the gravitational field is strongest. Once that field begins to weaken even incrementally, even in ways that are invisible in any single quarter's data, the compounding effects are difficult to reverse. Which brings us to the question that the $50 billion figure is really asking. Not whether Tokyo is collapsing. It is not collapsing in any dramatic, visible sense. The trains still run. The streets are still among the cleanest in the world. The cuisine is still extraordinary. The skyline still communicates competence and ambition. But beneath all of that surface integrity, something structural is shifting. And the people who understand cities, who have watched Detroit lose its industrial logic, who have watched Liverpool rebuild itself over 3 decades after its port traffic evaporated, who have watched the Latin American cities that boomed and then contracted as the commodity cycles that sustained them reversed. Those people are asking the question that Tokyo's official narrative is not yet prepared to answer. What does a city do when the assumptions that built it no longer hold? Detroit's answer to that question was instructive and brutal. A city of nearly 2 million at its peak, the manufacturing capital of the most powerful industrial economy in the 20th century, with an automotive sector that seemed too structurally embedded to fail. And then, over the course of roughly 40 years, a slow evacuation of the economic logic that had made Detroit necessary. By 2013, when the city filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, the population had fallen below 700,000. The physical city remained, the social and economic city had departed. Left behind were buildings that nobody had a plan for, infrastructure that could not be maintained at its existing scale for a population a third the size it had been designed to serve, and a civic memory of greatness that made every present limitation feel like a wound. Tokyo will not become Detroit. The comparison would be lazy and misleading, and this channel does not deal in lazy comparisons. Tokyo's diversification, cultural, technological, institutional, is vastly deeper than Detroit's dependency on a single industry ever was. But the underlying mechanism of a city, discovering that the world has reorganized itself in ways that reduce its centrality, that mechanism is not unique to Detroit. It is one of the oldest stories in urban history. It happened to Carthage, it happened to Constantinople, it happened to Lisbon when the maritime trade routes it had built its empire around became less relevant. It is happening now, in a different register, in different sectors, to a city that the world agreed was supposed to be the exception. The critical indicator to watch, and this is what the investors and analysts who move serious capital are watching, is what happens to the prime residential market in central Tokyo over the next 24 to 36 months. For the past decade, that market has been sustained by a combination of domestic corporate buyers, Japanese ultra-high net worth individuals recycling liquidity, and foreign institutional capital drawn by the yen carry advantage and the structural stability argument. Strip out the currency arbitrage as the Bank of Japan gradually, tentatively, almost apologetically moves away from its ultra-loose policy position, and the foreign capital equation changes materially. Strip out the demographic tailwind for domestic demand, which is already in structural decline, and the internal support weakens. What remains is a market that was priced for a set of conditions that is in the process of ceasing to exist. The luxury new-build condominium towers going up in Minato and Shibuya and Shirokane are not a sign of health in that context. They are a sign of inertia. Construction pipelines approved and financed in a different interest rate environment, a different demographic projection, a different tourist spending model. They will complete. They will be marketed aggressively, and some of them will find buyers. But the absorption rate, the speed at which the market can actually digest that new supply, is a number that is increasingly difficult to model optimistically if you are willing to look at the underlying demand structure. Honestly, a real estate consultant who has advised both domestic Japanese developers and foreign private equity on Tokyo market positioning described the current environment with a phrase that has stayed with me. We are not in a crash. We are in a recalibration. But recalibrations in real estate are not symmetric. They take longer to unwind than the conditions that caused them took to build. And when the recalibration involves demographics, you cannot just wait for the cycle to turn. The cycle is the people. And the people are not coming back. There is something almost melancholy about standing in one of Tokyo's great public spaces, the plaza, in front of Tokyo Station, for example, where, on a busy afternoon in 2019, the human density felt almost physical, almost overwhelming in its energy, and noticing, in 2024, that the energy is slightly different. Not gone, not dramatically reduced, but different. Quieter, in a way that is not quite silence, but registers as something subtracted. Older in a way that the demographics confirm and the eye can now verify. The city is still magnificent, but magnificence and permanence are different qualities, and Tokyo is in the process of learning, as every great city eventually learns, that they do not necessarily travel together. What happens next depends on choices that are not yet fully made. Japan has, in recent years, shown some signs of a more serious engagement with immigration as a partial demographic stabilizer, carefully, incrementally, in ways that reflect the genuine political complexity of a society that has maintained an extraordinary degree of cultural cohesion, partly through strict limits on external entry. The question of whether that engagement will accelerate to anything approaching the scale that the demographic math requires is one that demographers are not optimistic about, at least on any timeline that would materially alter the trajectory of the next decade. The corporate governance reforms that have genuinely improved the attractiveness of Tokyo-listed equities to international investors, represent a real positive development, one that the city and the country deserve credit for. The TSE's push to force listed companies to address chronically low price-to-book ratios, to return capital to shareholders, to appoint independent directors with real authority. These are structural improvements that will have lasting effects. But they operate at the level of corporate balance sheets, not at the level of a city's human and demographic vitality. A better governed company is not the same thing as a more populated, more economically generative, more self-renewing city. The $50 billion figure, then, is not just a financial number. It is a proxy for something larger. It represents the accumulated gap between what Tokyo was built to be and what the structural conditions of the 2020s and 2030s will allow it to sustain. Closing that gap, or managing it intelligently rather than denying it, is the central urban challenge of the coming decade for a city that the world still regards as one of the great achievements of organized human civilization. That regard is not wrong. Tokyo is extraordinary. Its resilience is real. Its capacity for institutional adaptation has been demonstrated before in the Meiji transformation, in the post-war reconstruction, in the recovery from the 1995 Kobe earthquake, and the 2011 Tohoku disaster that tested the country's social fabric in ways that would have fractured less cohesive societies. Tokyo has earned its reputation for endurance, but endurance and stasis are not the same. And the city that endures the next 30 years will not be the same city that built the reputation it is currently living on. Something will be shed, something will be lost. The question that historians will eventually ask, and that the most perceptive observers are beginning to ask right now, is whether what is lost will be regarded as the natural evolution of a living city, or as the beginning of a diminishment that the people inside it were not willing to see clearly until it was already far advanced. Empires do not fall in a day, they fall in patterns, in decisions that seem reasonable in isolation and structural in aggregate, in demographic data that appears in government reports and gets filed and discussed and gently set aside because the implications are too large to act on at the speed they require, in retail vacancies that are explained away as temporary, in financial talent that relocates for reasons that are described as personal and are actually structural, in a skyline that still looks extraordinary and a foundation that is quieter than it should be. Tokyo looked invincible. The trains, the technology, the density of human achievement packed into 40 million lives organized with improbable precision. But the signs were always there, for anyone willing to read them without the filter of the mythology. And the mythology, the Tokyo mythology, perhaps the most powerful urban mythology of the late 20th century, has been the most effective thing standing between the world and a clear view of what is actually happening. We see it now, and once you see it, it does not go away. Tell us in the comments, which city do you think follows this pattern next? Which megacity is running on mythology while the foundation quietly shifts? We read every suggestion, and the next chapter of Empire Falls is already in production. Subscribe, because what we document here, the world will be discussing in 5 years. You are watching it